Have you ever noticed that the most dangerous part of being an empath isn't the pain? People think the worst thing is being betrayed. They think the worst thing is loving the wrong person. They think the worst thing is being manipulated, lied to, abandoned, or used. But they are wrong. The real pain was never what others did to you. The real pain was what you slowly learned to do to yourself in order to survive them. The true horror begins when an empath becomes so skilled at understanding everyone else's emotions that they completely lose contact with their own. And that is where this story starts. Not with abuse, not with heartbreak, not with betrayal, but with a silent disappearance, the disappearance of the self. Because there are three phases every empath eventually travels through. Three psychological territories, three emotional worlds. And almost nobody talks about what happens during the second one. The second phase is where identities collapse, relationships fracture, illusions die, and the person staring back from the mirror becomes someone unfamiliar. It is the darkest phase, the loneliest phase, the most misunderstood phase, but it is also the doorway to freedom. Stay with me, because what happens next changes everything. According to the work of Chase Hughes, human behavior follows patterns far deeper than most people realize. Hughes discovered something unsettling about people who spend years sacrificing themselves for others. The traits they suppress never disappear. The emotions they bury never die. The instincts they reject never vanish. They wait, quietly, patiently, like shadows gathering strength behind a locked door. And according to Jungian psychology, this process is connected to something called shadow integration. Carl Jung understood something terrifying. The qualities we deny in ourselves eventually demand expression. The anger we suppress, the boundaries we abandon, the power we reject, the instincts we label as selfish. All of it remains alive beneath the surface, waiting, observing, growing stronger in darkness. Jung called this the shadow, and Hughes repeatedly emphasized that human beings suffer tremendously when they become disconnected from parts of themselves that are necessary for survival. This is where the empath's journey begins. Phase 1, the absorber, the emotional sponge, the person who enters every room carrying invisible buckets, not to collect their own feelings, but everyone else's. From childhood, many empaths unconsciously learn that peace must be purchased, love must be earned, acceptance must be negotiated, and conflict must be avoided at all costs. So they adapt. They become listeners, caretakers, fixers, rescuers, emotional firefighters running toward every blaze while their own house quietly burns behind them. Every relationship becomes another opportunity to prove their worth, another opportunity to save someone, another opportunity to heal wounds they never created. And for a while, it feels noble, it feels meaningful, it feels like purpose. But there is a hidden cost. Every time they silence their needs, something disappears. Every time they tolerate disrespect, something disappears. Every time they choose harmony over honesty, something disappears. Until one day they look around and realize they have become strangers to themselves. Like a river diverted so many times that it no longer remembers its original course. They become a sponge for pain, a container for everyone else's emotions, a refuge for people fleeing responsibility. And because empaths can feel so deeply, manipulators often recognize them long before the empath recognizes the manipulator. The narcissist sees possibility. The controller sees opportunity. The emotional vampire sees a food source. Not because empaths are weak, but because their compassion often outruns their boundaries. So they forgive, again, and again, and again, each betrayal explained away, each red flag transformed into empathy, each warning sign converted into understanding. They become architects building bridges for people who only burn them, pouring themselves into a bottomless well, offering oceans to people who cannot appreciate a single drop. Years pass, sometimes decades, and the exhaustion becomes difficult to describe. Not physical exhaustion, soul exhaustion, the kind that settles into the bones, the kind that makes silence feel heavier than noise, the kind that creates a loneliness no crowded room can cure. Inside, something is beginning to crack, like a rubber band stretched beyond its design, not broken yet, but dangerously close. And then phase 2 arrives. The phase nobody prepares you for. The hardest phase. The phase that feels like dying. At first, nothing dramatic happens. There is no explosion, no confrontation, no cinematic declaration. The empath simply becomes tired. Not angry, not bitter, tired. A very specific kind of tired. The kind that comes from carrying emotional weight that was never yours. The kind that comes from years of self-abandonment. The kind that comes from constantly translating your pain into forgiveness for others. And then something unexpected occurs. A quiet click. Almost inaudible, almost invisible, but permanent. Like a lock turning deep inside the mind. Like a receiver shutting down after years of static. Like a bridge collapsing in complete silence. The empath stops reaching. Not because they don't care, because they finally see. The illusion breaks. The spell ends. The pattern becomes visible. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. This moment terrifies people around them, because nothing appears different externally. The empath still smiles, still speaks, still functions, but internally, an entire psychological world has collapsed. The person who endlessly chased understanding suddenly stops running. The person who always explained suddenly becomes silent. The person who carried everyone else's burdens quietly sets them down. This is where Hughes's understanding of psychological compensation becomes profoundly important. Nature seeks balance, the psyche seeks equilibrium, and when someone spends years suppressing strength, eventually strength demands expression. When someone spends years suppressing anger, eventually anger demands acknowledgement. When someone spends years abandoning themselves, eventually the self returns. Not politely, not gently, but powerfully. The shadow begins knocking. And this is the part most people misunderstand. They think the empath is becoming cold. They think the empath is becoming selfish. They think the empath has changed. What they fail to understand is that the empath is finally becoming whole. The traits they spent years rejecting begin returning. Boundaries, discernment, distance, self-respect, protective instincts. The very qualities they feared becoming are now the qualities saving them. Imagine a fortress abandoned for years, its gates broken, its walls neglected, its defenses dismantled. Anyone could enter, anyone could take, anyone could leave damage behind. Then one day the fortress awakens. The gates close, the walls rise, the guards return, and suddenly those who benefited from unlimited access call it cruelty. But it was never cruelty. It was security. It was survival. It was sovereignty. This is where phase 2 becomes so painful, because every illusion must die. The illusion that love can heal everyone. The illusion that sacrifice guarantees loyalty. The illusion that understanding creates accountability. The illusion that endless patience eventually changes people. One by one, these beliefs shatter, like glass hitting stone, like mirrors cracking under pressure, like a house finally illuminated after years of darkness. And what the empath sees is heartbreaking. Many relationships existed only because boundaries didn't. Many connections survived only because self-abandonment remained active. Many people stayed because access was unrestricted. The realization cuts deeply, deeper than betrayal itself. Because now the empath sees the truth. Some people loved the service, not the soul. Some people loved the giving, not the giver. Some people loved the access, not the person. And this realization creates grief unlike anything they have experienced before. Not grief for others, grief for themselves, grief for the years lost, grief for the energy spent, grief for the identity sacrificed. Like standing beside a well they spent decades filling only to discover it had no bottom. The pain is immense. But hidden within that pain is transformation. Because phase 2 is not destruction, it is revelation. The collapse is creating space. The ending is creating beginning. The death is creating rebirth. And that brings us to the most powerful moment of all, the shadow breakthrough. According to Jungian psychology, individuation begins when a person stops running from the parts of themselves they were taught to fear. The empath begins meeting the self they abandoned. The self that knows how to say no. The self that knows how to walk away. The self that values peace over approval. The self that understands compassion without self-sacrifice. This encounter feels sacred because for the first time, they are not rescuing someone else. They are rescuing themselves. The anger they feared becomes wisdom. The boundaries they feared become protection. The distance they feared becomes clarity. The shadow becomes ally. And suddenly, the emotional leash snaps. The signal that once connected them to endless drama goes dark. The hooks no longer hold. The manipulation no longer lands. The guilt no longer penetrates. Something extraordinary is happening. The empath is becoming immune. The moment an empath enters this stage, manipulators experience something they have rarely encountered before: resistance. Not loud resistance, not angry resistance, silent resistance, the most powerful kind. For years, guilt worked. For years, apologies reopened doors. For years, emotional performances restored access. For years, love bombing reset the cycle. But now the machinery fails. The buttons no longer function. The script no longer works. The hooks find nothing to grab, and the manipulator becomes confused because they are witnessing something they never expected: an empath who finally understands their value. Imagine a fisherman casting a line into water he has successfully fished for years. Every cast once produced results. Every lure once attracted attention. Every strategy once succeeded. Then suddenly nothing bites. The water has changed. The fish have disappeared. The entire system has stopped responding. That is what emotional detachment feels like to a manipulator: an extinguished signal, a dead frequency, a locked gate where an open doorway once stood. This is why manipulative individuals often become increasingly desperate during this phase. Not because they miss the empath, because they miss access. Access to emotional energy, access to attention, access to forgiveness, access to control. And when those resources vanish, confusion follows. Sometimes they become charming. Sometimes they become apologetic. Sometimes they become aggressive. Sometimes they become victims. But regardless of the strategy, the result remains the same. Nothing works. Because the empath is no longer reacting. And reaction was always the fuel. Without reaction, reaction, control evaporates. Without reaction, manipulation collapses. Without reaction, the illusion dies. This realization creates one of the most haunting moments in the entire journey. The empath finally understands that emotional freedom was never about changing other people. It was about changing access. The prison was never the manipulator. The prison was the belief that their behavior required your participation. Once that belief dissolves, the cage door opens. The chains fall away, the leash snaps, and the person who once felt trapped begins walking toward a different life. This is the birth of psychological immunity, a state Hughes often described through the lens of behavioral mastery. When you understand the game, you stop becoming vulnerable to the rules. When you recognize manipulation, it loses its mystery. When you understand projection, you stop carrying emotions that do not belong to you. When you recognize self-abandonment, you stop volunteering for suffering. Psychological immunity does not mean becoming emotionless. It means becoming conscious, and consciousness changes everything. The empath begins noticing things they previously ignored. They notice how quickly people reveal themselves when boundaries appear. They notice who respects limits and who resents them. They notice who celebrates growth and who fears it. They notice who loved them and who merely benefited from them. This awareness feels like stepping out of a fog that lasted years, perhaps decades. The world itself appears different, not because reality changed, because perception changed. A shattered illusion can never be rebuilt exactly as it was. Once truth enters, innocence leaves. And although that sounds tragic, it is actually liberation. Because now the empath possesses something they lacked before: discernment. The ability to distinguish genuine connection from emotional dependency. The ability to recognize sincerity without becoming naive. The ability to love without surrendering identity. This is individuation. This is the psychological process Jung described as becoming fully oneself. Not the self others demanded, not the self trauma created, not the self fear maintained. The authentic self, the integrated self, the sovereign self. A new stillness begins emerging. Not weakness, not numbness, stillness. The kind found at the center of storms. The kind found in ancient mountains. The kind found in oceans beneath violent waves. For the first time, external chaos stops determining internal reality. People can criticize, people can misunderstand, people can leave, people can project, and yet something remains unmoved. The emotional fortress is complete. Not built from anger, built from awareness. Not built from resentment. Built from truth, not built from fear, built from self-respect. And this changes every relationship moving forward, because the empath no longer enters relationships searching for validation. They enter relationships searching for alignment, a profound difference. Validation asks, will you choose me? Alignment asks, do we belong in each other's lives? Validation fears rejection. Alignment welcomes clarity. Validation sacrifices authenticity. Alignment demands authenticity. One creates dependency, the other creates freedom. This is why the final phase often appears mysterious to outsiders. People assume the empath has become detached from life, but the opposite is true. They have become deeply connected to reality, and reality requires no illusions, no fantasies, no emotional bargaining, only truth. Phase 3, the sovereign. The person who once explained everything now explains very little. The person who once defended themselves now rarely defends at all. The person who once chased closure no longer needs it. Something remarkable has happened. They have stopped negotiating with reality. Radical acceptance has arrived. Not passive acceptance, not resignation, acceptance. The understanding that people reveal themselves through patterns, not promises. The understanding that behavior speaks louder than intention. The understanding that truth requires observation, not interpretation. This stage often looks like indifference, but true indifference is not hatred, it is transcendence. Hatred still creates attachment. Resentment still creates attachment. Bitterness still creates attachment. True indifference creates freedom. The manipulator no longer occupies mental space. The betrayer no longer influences emotional weather. The past no longer controls present decisions. The empath becomes psychologically unreachable. Not because walls became permanent, because wisdom became permanent. Imagine a house that spent years vulnerable to intrusion. Broken windows, unlocked doors, no boundaries, no protection. Then imagine that house fully restored, secure, protected, peaceful. Not isolated, simply safe. That is what Phase 3 feels like. The soul finally coming home to itself. There is no revenge here, no dramatic confrontation, no final speech, no desperate need to be understood, only quiet certainty. The certainty of someone who survived their own transformation. The certainty of someone who walked through emotional darkness and discovered hidden strength. The certainty of someone who stopped searching for permission to exist. The need to explain disappears. The need to justify disappears. The need to convince disappears. Because self-worth no longer depends on agreement, and that realization changes everything. Perhaps the most beautiful part of this phase is what returns. Joy returns. Curiosity returns. Creativity returns. Peace returns. Not the fragile peace of avoidance, the powerful peace of alignment. The peace that comes from no longer betraying yourself. The peace that comes from honoring your intuition. The peace that comes from trusting your own perception. And suddenly life feels different, lighter, cleaner, more honest. The emotional armor forged in fire remains, but it no longer feels heavy. It feels natural, an extension of wisdom, a reminder of lessons earned through experience. The scars remain, but they no longer hurt. They become evidence, proof of survival, proof of transformation, proof that what almost destroyed you ultimately revealed you. And that may be the deepest psychological truth of all. The people who hurt you were never the final chapter. The betrayal was never the final chapter. The manipulation was never the final chapter. Even the suffering was never the final chapter. The final chapter was always you, finding you, meeting you, remembering you. Because the greatest tragedy was never that others failed to see your value. The greatest tragedy was that you spent years forgetting it yourself. And the greatest victory is not being loved by everyone. It is finally refusing to abandon yourself for anyone. That is the journey. 3 phases: the absorber, the awakening, the sovereign. Not a path of becoming cold, a path of becoming complete. Not a path of losing humanity, a path of reclaiming it. Not a path of isolation, a path of freedom. And perhaps that is why so few people understand what truly happened. They think they lost access to you. They think you changed. They think you became distant. But they misunderstand the transformation entirely. You were never disappearing. You were emerging. You were never shutting down. You were waking up. You were never becoming less loving. You were finally learning how to love yourself. And the silence they hear now is not emptiness. It is not loneliness. It is not defeat. It is the sound of a soul returning to its rightful place, the sound of illusion collapsing, the sound of chains breaking, the sound of sovereignty being born. Because in the end, they were never losing you. You were finding yourself. And once an empath finds themselves, the journey is no longer about being chosen. They have already chosen themselves, and that changes everything.